And so first, this morning, we have Elaine Miller from Miami University of Ohio giving her paper, Kristeva and Arendt on Aesthetic Estrangement. So let's welcome Dr. Miller.
So I just want to explain that this paper is a little too long, and so I'm going to be talking through some things that I would have normally read, and so if something isn't clear, hopefully you can ask me in the question and answers. So I became interested in the idea of aesthetic estrangement through several things in Kristeva's work. One is, of course, her own biography that we heard about last night. You know, the fact that she herself was an immigrant, that she felt herself never to quite be in one culture or another, that she was between cultures, that she was kind of a boundary subject, which is also how she describes two people who had a great influence on her, or one who had a great influence on her, the other was an artist that she particularly admired. So Hannah Arendt.
Is that better or worse? Sorry.
It's fine, yeah, it's good. I think it's better for the students. So one, of course, was Hannah Arendt, and the quote I have up on the screen is one that's from actually Kristeva's essay on Louise Bourgeois, who's the artist whom I'm also going to talk about a little bit. So Hannah Arendt liked to identify with a line from Schiller, ein Mädchen aus der Fremde, a girl from elsewhere, a girl from out of the foreign. A girl in quest of the father, fleeing the father, replacing the father begetter and the intellectual master in order to reimagine, repostulate herself indefinitely without foundation, a continuous refoundation then, a new blossoming every instant. And I think that this quote kind of encapsulates Kristeva's interest in the concept of estrangement, aesthetic estrangement, that it's a kind of intentional lingering with that which is foreign in order to avoid this kind of rigid fixation in either one nation, one culture, one language, one symbolic order, and so that art is the place where this position of intentional estrangement, self-estrangement can happen, and it can be productive and creative. So, sorry, operating with too many things. So Louise Bourgeois, this is a sculpture by Bourgeois that is called Topiary 4 that Kristeva talks about in her essay. And she was interested in Bourgeois both because she liked her art, but also because of her life. She calls her life survival therapy. Bourgeois was abandoned at a young age by her father, and her father her mother, I believe, died. Her father abandoned her, but first had an extended affair with her nanny, her family's living nanny. She was also witness to 2 world wars. She moved to the United States after marrying an American, and she herself sort of began to identify as an American rather than as a French citizen. But she also was sort of between cultures in the same way that Arendt was when she moved to the United States. And Bourgeois provides a wealth of information on her personal life and how it directly affected her art. And Kristeva in her essay focuses on Bourgeois' extraordinary ability to sublimate. She calls her Bourgeois herself says, I left France because I freed myself or escaped from home. I was a runaway girl. Let's say it in English now, I was a runaway girl. I was running away from a family situation that was very disturbing. So that whole family situation can also be a metaphor for the homeland or the motherland as well. And in this sculpture, which is, so we all are familiar with Arendt's, sorry, I'm getting them all mixed up now, Kristeva's work on the severed head, which deals with a Louvre exhibit in which she examines images of beheadings in art. But this is kind of the opposite of this. Although the woman has no head, she has herself created a head. She's created a beautiful flowering tree out of, and the woman, I don't know if you can see in this image too well, but she has a little crutch here. So she's very much an injured or finite woman, she's one who's been wounded, and yet out of that wound, she has created something beautiful. Speaking of this, this is a very long quote, I won't read all of it, but this is what Kristeva says about To Theory 4. She says, it's a tree woman, the perfect anti-siren. Instead of exchanging the lower half of her body for a fishtail dreaming of fresh water, the tree woman knows that one day her legs will fail. She will need a crutch. But she keeps the lower half of her body as it was. She dresses it even with the satin dress of a young girl. And adds a proliferating head. Her sap has risen to the top, and defoliated though she now is, this tree woman can seduce nonetheless through the tufts of jewels put forth from the tips of her branches. And she sort of sees this as a metaphor for the artist, and she says it could be a man or a woman who has this kind of psychic plasticity to transform the wound into something beautiful. Okay. So I think that there's something similar to this in her interest in Hannah Arendt's concept of natality, or a kind of second birth. So not the birth that we are born biologically into the world, but the second birth by which we are born into the world of language and action. So I want to explore this concept of estrangement in Kristeva's work through various different sources. So in her early work, Kristeva was interested in the concept of estrangement as it was espoused by the Russian formalists, and in particular the Russian formalist theory Viktor Shklovsky. And Shklovsky and Roman Jakobson used the concept of estrangement to talk about poetic language. And they argued that the function of metaphor in poetic language is the opposite of its function in ordinary speech. So in ordinary speech, we use metaphors in order to make something unfamiliar more familiar to us by comparing it to something familiar. But in poetry, the familiar is defamiliarized. So a metaphor is used to make the familiar unfamiliar by translating it into something new. And by doing this, something new can be unveiled. And this theory shares characteristics also with surrealism, surrealist collage, Dada art, and also Bertolt Brecht's concept of what he called the Verfremdungs effect, or the estrangement effect. And Brecht would intentionally create his plays in such a way that it would prevent the audience from being sucked into the narrative and sort of, we think about art as, sometimes we think about a good book or a theater play as one in which you forget that, that it's just a play. You get sucked into it and it becomes part of your world. Brecht tried to intentionally prevent that effect and make it so that we always were aware that you were watching a play. And so this was a kind of salutary estrangement. It wasn't the kind of estrangement, it was kind of a not a corrective, but a kind of counterpart to the Hegelian and Marxist idea of estrangement as a problem. So here it was estrangement as an intentional effect of art. And Kristeva does criticize Russian formalism. She has an essay on Russian formalism called The Ruin of the Poetics, and she criticizes it mainly for ignoring the lived body and for ignoring the speaking subject in her embodied origin. And so she was interested in her early work in the theorist Bakhtin because he foregrounded ways in which discourse is constantly disturbed by the intervention of a representation which no longer has any poetic phenomenon to describe. So he shifts the analysis rather to the rules by which the speaking subject is brought into being. And that was had a huge effect on her early work, in particular in revolution in poetic language. So she was initially, of course, as we all know, interested in poetic language and in poetry, but in her later work she's also turned her attention to other forms of art. So she's interested in installation art in The Sense and Nonsense of Revolt. She talks about installations by Hans Hake and Robert Wilson at the Biennale, and both of these installations literally represented the collapse of foundations. They were rooms in which you walked in and the ground gave way under your feet. And she thought that that was a way in which this phenomenon of estrangement could take place, not just in language, but also in terms of a kind of visual art. Likewise, in Intimate Revolt, Kristeva discusses a seminar of the Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein, where a scene of confrontation is being mapped out by the director and the students. And Eisenstein actually had a very precise way of mapping out the rhythmic antagonistic elements of a scene. It had nothing to do with the narrative, but it had to do with the way in which lines crossed in the action of the film. And it was a kind of, he called it a kind of spatially organized rhythm in which one can dynamically apprehend the signifier in the multiplicities of its ever-changing manifestations. And by doing this, by having this rhythm that would go along with the narrative or the symbolic story, there was a kind of disruption of the symbolic narrative that affected the viewer not on an intellectual level, but on a truly bodily level. And in Strangers to Ourselves, of course, that's the text that we would probably most associate with the phenomenon of estrangement, where she's talking about the stranger that is within all of us, our unconscious. And she, in that text, examines Enlightenment fiction that takes the figure of the foreigner as a kind of protagonist who invites the reader to go on a journey to encounter otherness and to return to self. And that kind of phenomenon of encountering otherness and returning to self is something that we might associate with Hegel or Marx as well. But Kristeva points out that in texts like Montesquieu's Persian Letters and Voltaire's Zadig and Candide, this process is slightly subverted in that in encountering exotic otherness, instead of just a return to self that allows one to, enrich oneself and become a better version of oneself. Instead, there becomes a kind of critique of self, or ability to laugh at self or judge one's own limitations. And in particular, Kristeva focuses on Diderot's Rameau's Nephew, which is also a text which Hegel talks about in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And Hegel talks about this in a section that's called Spirit as Self-Estrangement. In this text, there are two main characters. There is a nephew, and there's a sort of philosopher position, and the philosopher speaks very rationally and logically, whereas the nephew is just kind of speaking through a series of bodily tics. Convulsions, laughter, he's disrupting the possibility of even having a kind of conversation. For Hegel, this play kind of manifests the contradictions inherent in the Enlightenment itself. So on the one hand, there's an adherence to universalist claims about reason and order and law, but on the other hand, there's a kind of embrace of individual subjectivity, a kind of anything goes, I'm creating myself, and that Hegel saw as a fundamental contradiction. But Kristeva instead draws out the idea of the nephew as a kind of intellectual foreigner who cannot be simply assimilated or sublated. And she calls this, she refers to this as a kind, she kind of relates this to romantic irony, which was a theme discussed in particular by Friedrich Schlegel and very heavily criticized by Hegel as a kind of limitless self arrogance that kind of accords to the self, anything goes, kind of a liberating, creative potential that Hegel worried would leave no substantial identity. Kristeva's conception of irony is quite different. She draws on Roland Barthes, who writes that irony is nothing other than the question which language puts to language. Language, according to Barthes, is a form of negativity, a problem that critics are always trying to solve. And Kristeva is thinking of this as a kind of infinity. The task of the critic is to posit the writer as a knot in the infinite unfolding. Someone who has stolen from and reported fragments of the old text of culture, science, and literature, but also, very importantly, changed its features according to formulae of disguise. Okay, I haven't even gotten to Arendt yet, so I will jump. Okay, so in her Feminine Genius volume, Kristeva analyzes Arendt's reading of Kant And, you know, the volume is the subtitle of the volume is Birth and Estrangement. And I think the birth part is very sort of intuitive to us, that she would be talking about birth. We wouldn't normally associate estrangement with Arendt. And so I just wanted to talk briefly about what she might mean by, she thinks that there is a discourse of salutary estrangement in Arendt. So on the one hand, she talks about narration, and well, first of all, she talks about the two-in-one in Arendt. So the idea that consciousness or thinking is a dialogue that I have with myself. So there's always this other within myself that I have a dialogue with. And Arendt says in The Human Condition, or sorry, in The Life of the Mind, she says that when thinking takes possession of a thing, it, quote, loses its reality and acquires a curious kind of eeriness. Arendt also had a lot of meditations on the phenomenon of Jewish homelessness after World War II. She talks about the status of Jewish refugees and her own status as someone who, although she had adopted a new country and fit in quite well, she felt always that she did not quite fit. And the fact that she wrote in English, and she intentionally wrote in English in her post-war writings, meant that she was writing in a language that was somewhat strange to her, and that affected her thinking. And also, Arendt talks about the bios theoretikos in Aristotle's terms as a bios xenikos, or a foreigner. So the other thing that I wanted to talk briefly about was Kafka, and both Kristeva and Arendt talk about Kafka. Arendt talks about Kafka's early prose pieces as presenting us with thought things completely estranged from any context, transformed by thought. And I just thought one example of this, maybe the best example of this, is this is actually a photograph by the Canadian artist Jeff Wall, but it's entitled Odradek. And I don't know if you are familiar with the story, The Cares of a Family Man by Kafka, in which there's this entity called Odradek. He's a flat star-shaped spool with bits of thread wound about it. And it's just this monstrous, completely thought thing that's completely severed from any context. And this picture shows Odradek is behind the stairs. Can't really see it, but and I think there's something about this work of art which is defamiliarizing me every day, especially with the title. For Kristeva, what Kafka's writing does is to put us in the perspective of the foreigner as we are looking at our own culture. And I think that might be one of the things that Kristeva would like for us to be able to do, to be able to experience our own culture as a foreign culture, that would allow us to see certain things that we couldn't see otherwise. Just want to touch over this. In The Human Condition, Arendt addresses the work of art directly. Art is the result of human beings overreaching themselves, producing useless things that are unrelated to material or even intellectual needs. It's no accident that the name of the mother of the ancient muses was Mnemosyne, or remembrance, something humans need only when their existence becomes more than a striving to survive. Kristeva makes an analogous claim about the subject's memory and consciousness in the analytical situation. So the way in which Arendt talks about the work of art is similar to the way in which Kristeva talks about the psychoanalytic situation. She also talks about Arendt's discussion of narration as a kind of form of estrangement, but she thinks that today we're in a time of hyperbolic narration. Everything is narrated constantly and very easily, and so that what is needed instead is perhaps, and I think Arendt also foresaw the increasing superficiality of the representation of human action in the media. So I think that art's role is to, instead of, for Kristeva, is instead of perpetuating constant narration, it's to kind of interrupt that narration and allow for us to get a view of something which is less familiar to us in order to open up something new. And that's Great.
So we've got some time for questions.
Questions in between?
Yeah, that was my thought.
Oh, sorry, in-house.
That's great. Yeah.
As I understand it, the project of art since about the middle of the 19th century, like around the 1850s, 1860s, has been radically different to at least the art of our culture before then. Does either Arendt or Kristeva have something to say about the different stages of art, the different project that is art?
I mean, I think that Arendt's analysis is definitely of art is, except for her discussion of Kafka, is more traditional. And I think part of, I don't think Arendt herself probably would have thought of art. I mean, she does say that certain artworks are estranging, but she always thinks that that is not a good thing, that there has to be a kind of reintegration of the artwork into a context that is understandable, et cetera. Whereas I think for Kristeva there is more of a, and I think this is borne out in more contemporary art, that there's more of a need for art to resist that kind of reintegration, to resist explanation. So yeah, I think that there is a discussion of that, maybe not as explicit a way as I tried to articulate here.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about the quote that you started with, and you left out the second half because it's too long. But I wanted to draw attention to the second half and ask a question about it as it relates to your notion about estrangement, salutary estrangement, or aesthetic salutary estrangement. She says that the psychic plasticity transforms the wound into, quote, a blossoming tree. The trunk and branches may be dry, but the thing proliferates nonetheless, ascends, ramifies, buds, not in juicy flavors, but in emerald jewels. Mm-hmm. And then the statement, the seduction of crystallization. Mm-hmm. And so my question is about crystallization. Yeah. And because I think that is something that is, there's some excess there in terms of, if you compare it to the beautiful, it's really, it's crystallization seems to suggest also symptom, seems to suggest something that is symptomatic. It's not just the effect of a work that is sublimatory, although it can also be sublimatory. So I'm wondering about the crystallization. How do you read that, and what might it, how might it be related to the salutary estrangement that you're discussing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're saying it's a symptom in that it's a kind of stuckness, it's a kind of fixation?
Yeah, well, I'm also thinking about Kristeva's work on the Cold War and Cold War art, and the image of the iceberg, and the patient as like the tip of an iceberg, sort of frozen in the time of the Cold War.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's really, I think it's important the word, the seduction of crystallization, right? Because
right.
That would be a kind of, so it's not in juicy flavors, but in emerald. Right there you see a contrast between a kind of natural image and a very artificial image. Or not necessarily artificial, because an emerald is natural too, but it's at least crafted. So there seems to be kind of a tension between nature and art there. And why would crystallization be seduction? Because I think seduction, because it's maybe easier, not to work through. There's a kind of escape, or there's a it might not be intentional, but the symptom is the symptom of something that has not been worked through or has not been dealt with. And, but at the same time, a crystal is beautiful, right? So, the emerald and the crystal are related. So I think her point in talking about bourgeois and Arendt is that natality or that budding or recreating oneself is something that they did. They didn't rest satisfied with just one accomplishment. But they, like bourgeois is very well known for having changed her style quite radically at times, you know. So there's a seduction to that, but then I think the point is that they were able to go beyond that. But I'm not familiar with the stuff on the Cold War, so I don't, maybe you have a thought on that, like how they could be connected.
Well, I was just wondering about that ambiguity between in that particular work of art, both as symptom and also as work.
I think that's the point of that work of art is that it remains, it's not a beautiful tree, right? It's a beautiful tree with a crutch and a, you know, older body according to her anyway. So that it's both. And so it's both symptom and a kind of addressing of the symptom, but the symptom doesn't simply go away. So it's a kind of wounded art.
We have time for one more question. Otherwise, if you've got if any arise in the following presentations, if we have time at the end, we may be able to fit it in. But any?
This notion that Kristeva saw, it'd be good if we could look at our culture with foreign culture. I wonder what a post-colonial critique would be. Was she aware of a post-colonial critique? Because
All earthy, recognize it, but yet we see it from the perspective, we're taken outside of it and able to just sort of see it for the first time as what it is. And I think that, you know, that at least on a personal level for Kristeva, there was something very, very powerful about living as a boundary subject that she saw in herself and in Kristeva and in bourgeois. So yeah, I don't think she talks about anything that would relate to a post-colonial critique explicitly, but I also don't think that it's a stretch to think about it in that way.
Thank you so much again. And next up we have Robert Shane, who's an assistant professor of art history at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. He received his PhD in art history and criticism from Stony Brook University. And today he will be delivering his paper entitled The Temporal Scar, Zeitlos and Revolt in Memorial Art. Let's welcome Robert.
When plans for Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial were first unveiled in 1981, reactions were passionate both for and against. Tom Carhart, a veteran who found the work deeply insulting, described it as, quote, a black trench that scars them all. While the outrage against Lin's monument has generally subsided, I think Carhart made an important observation. The work is, in fact, a kind of scar. It is a scar in the earth, and as I will argue is the case with all memorial, it is a temporal scar. The viewer witnesses the memorial object in the present, but it calls for her to return to the past. Just as whenever I look at a scar on my body, it brings me back to the moment, it brings me back in time to the moment of trauma. Kristeva's work in Intimate Revolt, particularly her analysis of the Freudian Zeitlos, or timelessness, provides an effective model for understanding the viewer's temporal experience of memorial. For Kristeva, the importance of revolt lies not in the future, as we tend to think when considering revolutionary politics, but in, quote, its questions and displacement of the past. Kristeva thus considers revolt as a return, and the Freudian revolt is the return to or remembrance of what was forgotten. Likewise, memorial disrupts the present and calls on the viewer to remember what a culture might prefer to forget. In this paper, I look at the work of 3 women artists whose memorials oscillate between time and timelessness. I will begin by first looking deeper into the temporal aspects of Maya Lin's monument, and then look at 2 other examples. Anna Sokolo's Kaddish, performed by Deborah Zoll, a danced memorial to Jews killed in the Holocaust, and Darcy Abatello's series of drawings of missing women. I will use Kristeva's work on Revolt to underscore 3 aspects of these memorials. 1, the role of the sensorial body. 2, the significance of stylistic revolt, which can be attuned to the semiotic and thus challenge and redefine the symbolic order. And 3, of course, revolt as a return to the past, which is experienced in the present. Processing all 3 of these aspects requires work on the part of the memorial's viewer, and this work is also the task of criticism. Memorial calls upon the viewer to make sense of the nonsense of its revolt, to give it a new symbolic language. Whenever I encounter a work of art, I bring my body with me. In Memorial, remembering happens in the body. Lin's monument makes this role of the viewer's body explicit. The viewer sees herself in the reflection of the highly polished granite, and as she does, she simultaneously sees the time of the events memorialized. The engraved names of the dead soldiers in the granite wall are listed not in alphabetical order, but in chronological order of their deaths. Historian Marita Sturken noted that an alphabetical listing of the names would not have paid tribute to the individuals in the same way. The 16 men named James Jones, for instance, are reduced to a statistic when they're lumped together. But as they are inscribed in time, we instead think of the singularity of each person's lived body and the year and moment of his or her death. Lin's monument is anachronistically structured, so that the beginning and end dates of the war meet in the middle of the monument. Starting at 1959, in the middle right, the viewer follows the names from left to right to the eastern end of one axis of the memorial. Then the viewer must walk all the way around to the other end of the monument to continue reading left to right again until arriving at 1975, back at the center of the monument. As the viewer walks, trying to follow the chronology, she is caught in a non-linear cycle, a temporal loop, a confusion that forces the viewer to consider the relation between her present lived body and the trauma of the past. How does the past shape the present that we see reflected in the monument? How would the present we see in the reflection be different if the dead were not names in the wall, but living bodies still beside us in time? As visitors and mourners walk along the wall and see themselves in time and in this other time, they often touch the wall with their fingers. They make rubbings of the names, recording on paper their moments in time with the monument. For this reason, Sturken rightly ascribes the wall a tactile quality. She argues that the names serve as surrogates for the body, and one visits the names as if visiting a grave for the body. In the performative act of making the rubbing, the viewer uses her body to connect with an absent body. Thus, Lin's temporal revolt is one linked to the body, an intimate and sensorial one. Lin's monument presented an aesthetic revolt. The outcry against the form of her work was such that a second monument was erected nearby, Frederick Hart's figurative sculpture. In addition to a return to a traditional aesthetic, Hart's sculpture is a return to a linear time. In it, we see men frozen in the moment of action, their heads in a process of turning. It's a point on a timeline. In her chapter, Women's Time, From New Maladies of the Soul, Kristeva associates linear time with cursive history, teleology, and a masculine obsessional sensibility. Hart's monument does not allow for the temporal ambiguities of what Kristeva calls women's time, that is, monumental, cyclical time, a time of both repetition, as seen in the temporal loop of Maya Lin's monument, and eternity, manifest in Lynn's choice of granite, which we kind of think of as a timeless material, a material that will stand the test of time. The resistance to Lynn's monument was due to its minimalist aesthetic and racism directed towards the artist. Additionally, I wish to suggest that the resistance was also a result of her memorial's monumental time and its implicit revolt against linear time. American modern dancer Anna Sokolow choreographed her solo Kaddish as a memorial to Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Set in 1945, just after the war ended, it was realized prior to any physical or permanent monument to the Holocaust in the United States. Once performed by herself and only rarely, in the 1970s, Sokolow taught the solo to 3 individual dancers, including Deborah Zoll, who you see pictured on the screen. Zoll has since performed this work internationally, teaches it to students when she travels, and has recently reset the work for 10 women to perform in unison. In the dance, Zoll wears Sokolow's costume, a dark tunic, and then wrapped on her arm is a representation of tefillin, leather straps and boxes containing scripture which are worn exclusively by men in Orthodox and conservative Judaism. She dances to a Maurice Ravel piece in which, over haunting violin and piano accompaniment, a tenor sings the Kaddish, that is, the Jewish prayer for the dead. The Kaddish is usually recited by mourners to memorialize a loved one who has died. However, as dance historian Hannah Kostrin points out, too many people were killed in the Holocaust for there to be enough people to say the Kaddish individually on each one's behalf. Therefore, Sokolow, as dancer, had to be a universal every person, who says it for those who have no one else to say it for them. But while the sung Kaddish, the tefillin, and movements borrowed from Jewish rituals all bear witness to the uniqueness of the Holocaust for Jews, Sokolow claimed that one not need be Jewish to understand the piece. The suffering of the victims is embodied in the painful, mournful movement of Deborah Zoll, which, in the words of Kostrin, includes spiraling turns, oppositional pulls and twists through the torso, a floor section rising onto knees and hips, impatient thrusts from the gut, and contemplative moments wherein pain meets anger and merges with quiet hope and defiance. Since the lived body is the medium of this memorial, the viewer, who brings her own lived body to witness the piece, can empathize with Kaddish's movement and content. Dance as a medium lends itself readily to this kind of corporeal empathy. In the words of John Martin, the critic who championed American modern dance, quote, "The onlooker feels sympathetically in his own musculature the exertions he sees in someone else's musculature. The dancer is able to convey through movement the most intangible emotional experience." This corporeal empathy is operative in the experience of all memorial, not just dance. We've seen already how the viewer brings her body with her to Lynn's memorial. Dance memorial merely makes the corporeal performance of all memorial explicit. It is the corporeal aspect that gives art its affective dimension. It speaks to the semiotic. As phenomenologist and dancer Sandra Horton-Frale writes, quote, "Dance is a pre-verbal expression, playing beneath words and at the same time moving beyond them. As impetus towards speech proper, dance founds meaning. Thus it is closer to the immediacy, rhythm, and origination of poetry than it is to linear language." In its semiotic sensuality, the dance embodies revolt against the symbolic order. While we may tend to associate memorial objects with durable materials, dance memorial is so powerful because it already embodies memorial's temporal structure. Sokolow's memorial happens at the ambivalent intersection of time and timelessness that I'm calling the temporal scar. The viewer watches and feels Zoll's performance in time, but this temporal performance enacts a rift in time in which the trauma of the past is reawakened. Choreographed dancing is always a crossing of past and present. Insofar as Kaddish is Sokolow's choreography, her written dance, then it is past, But what is the written dance without Zoll's dancing? When exactly is the dance? We think of dance and the performing arts in general as an ephemeral medium of the present, but in fact, the choreographed dance is always an echo of the past. In 2012, artist Darcy Abatello began a series of drawings and collages of missing women. One piece is Abatello's drawing Paula, 1946 Bennington College, which you see on the left. And I have a number of other works that I'll just kind of show by her as well, but that's the only one that I'll talk about specifically. Abatello begins her, this piece is a memorial to, the one on the left is a memorial to Paula Jean Weldon, born in 1928, who went missing at the age of 18, December 1956 in Bennington, Vermont. Abatello begins her work by searching through missing persons reports in the United States from the 20th century, and the oldest in her series goes back to 1937. Abatello then restores each woman's singularity through her drawing. On small, intimately scaled paper, they're no bigger than a sheet of paper like this. She renders the head and face of the missing woman, generally using a photograph, the kind of photograph that was on missing person signs and so forth. She then dresses the absent bodies in clothes described in the missing persons reports, last seen wearing. In Paula's case, she wears a pale red parka. The work returns us temporally to the moment of the disappearance because of the clothing. Thus, as memorial, Abatello's drawings are temporal scars. Here are just two more by her. These figures are rendered in a sea of white negative space. Their intimate detail makes them appear close, yet they are dislocated. Where are they? They are trapped in nowhere. When are they? They are trapped in no time. And Kristeva suggests that Zeitlos can also be translated as a kind of lost time. As memorial, Abatello's works are a way for us to remember the missing. Culturally, we forget. As Kristeva laments in both Intimate Revolt and The Sense and Nonsense of Revolt, the society of spectacle numbs its viewers and makes revolt as remembrance difficult. After the news sensation of the week has passed, after the carton of milk has expired on which the missing person's photo and description were printed, after the true crime television show has its final broadcast, we forget the missing. But family and friends remember, and Abatello's work compels us to remember as well. And to remember not by simply resurrecting the missing person's photograph, but by transforming it through the slow, intimate work of drawing. Compared to the source photograph, Abatello's drawing resensorializes Paula. The word intimate, Kristeva reminds us, is derived from the Latin intimus, the superlative form of interior. Abatello selects a missing woman when her story strikes a personal chord with her. Then she looks at her photograph. The act of looking is a way of internalizing the image, interiorizing it, and re-renders it with her own hand, her own body. It is this radical interiorization of her subject and her subsequent exteriorization in the drawing, which in turn strikes the viewer. The artist's embodied psychical and somatical process of creation invites our own interiorization of Paula's singularity. The danger of memorial, as historian Pierre Nora argued, is that memory in a physical exterior form can reduce the amount of internal work demanded of its viewer. Viewers become freed from doing what Jeffrey Young calls memory work. In the memorials I have presented, however, the artists are particularly effective at resisting the reification of memory and equally effective at resisting a closed, monolithic interpretation of the past which would prevent memory work. Their resistance is enabled by revolt embodied in the temporal structure and stylistic form of these memorials. Each artist transgressed memorial traditions and the conventions of her medium. Lynn's minimalist granite scar in the earth rejected the tradition of figurative memorial sculpture. Sokolo's modern style, grounded and emotional, defied the conventions of classical ballet. Abatello's intimate mark-making rejects the aesthetic of the society of spectacle. In Intimate Revolt, Kristeva devotes time to the question of style. Style must be creative in analytic language and in literature in order to express the paradoxes of time. New style breaks with the symbolic order and renegotiates the socio-symbolic contract. These memorials do not tell us how to view the past, by, say, heroicizing a person or glorifying an ideal. Rather, these pieces require the viewer to answer questions about the events memorialized for herself, including her own relation to history. Kristeva argues in The Sense and Nonsense of Revolt that interpretation itself is an act of revolt. And in Intimate Revolt, she points out that interpretation, particularly of a new style, requires work. I use work, as does Kristeva, in the psychoanalytic sense of working through trauma. Psychical trauma, the unconscious, and dreams are all timeless, according to Freud, because while rooted in events from the past, they affect us with emotional intensity in the present. For Kristeva, the work of psychoanalysis is to take the Zeitlos of the psychical past and inscribe it into the linear time of analysis. The memorial objects I presented evoke an ambivalent time by creating a temporal rift or scar. I am enjoying the DC Mall, the dance concert, the art museum. I am present with myself and the work, but then that present moment is scandalized as I am called upon to return to an earlier trauma. Though the trauma is not the viewer's own, the memorial, like a repressed memory that one might not care to remember, the memorial calls on its viewer to remember traumatic events in society, to remember traumatic events that society might prefer to forget. Viewing with her sensorial body, the viewer is called upon to make sense, meaning, and history of the memorial's temporal paradoxes. In none of these cases does the viewer resolve the past, find closure, or finish writing the history. On the contrary, the memory work of memorial resists reification and keeps memory vital, plastic, and living. Kelly Oliver wrote of love that as soon as I think I love someone, I have in fact stopped loving because I've objectified that person in my mind. I should instead always strive to be loving, that is, critically vigilant in always seeking to know the other person better. This is an important model for remembering. As soon as I think I know that history already, the history of the Vietnam War, the Holocaust, another missing person story, I threaten to reify it and forget its human cost, both corporeal and emotional. The time of memorial, which we can call women's time, monumental time, revolts against teleology or cursive history. As a temporal scar, memorial calls for the viewer with her body to return to the past in order to construct its memory always and again for the first time. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Shane?
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I have a question. In Sokolov dance, is it always with a white background?
No, that's just some studio shots that Deborah Zoll had done professionally. Normally it's just on whatever particular stage, but there is no decor for the stage, no sort of props or set or anything very start.
Well, what I find so interesting when you were talking about the negative, the white space, how, at least in that portrait, in that picture, and then if you look at the memorial, when you rub the name, it goes onto a white space too.
Yes.
And so it just is another way, I think, that reinforces your idea of being out of context or being out of time. I thought it was interesting.
Thank you.
As a sort of preface, from your talk, I didn't get the sense that there was all and then the milk carton. There wasn't the same kind of controversy about the practices of memorialization that there was in the violin.
No.
Right?
Yep.
Right. So okay. So my question then is, could you maybe talk a little bit? The reason I like that you set these kind of art and and art, but different, like, right, side by side, is that it allows you, maybe as I'm asking you to do, to speak a little bit more, I think, to the relationship between the practices of memorialization and the sort of, the ways in which, like, public expectation, the practices of memorialization and art. Because here, you've got these two that are clearly art, not controversial. But then you've got the one that is also art, but it fulfills a very different rhetorical function in public practices of memorialization. And especially with respect to timelessness, this is, you know, the drive is not something that public memory studies has been so far capable of picking up and really utilizing, which is in effect what you're trying to do here. So since they seem, at least in response, to occupy different genres, what do you see as the relationship between art, or its art function, you know, in public, and practices of remembering?
So it's, in the larger project, it is an area that I acknowledge that I haven't been looking at as much. And because I've been concerned with both kind of the artist's kind of intimate relationship with the memorial, and then the viewer, thinking of the viewer almost as the patient in psychoanalysis, where you're almost kind of isolating that experience, and it's becoming this sort of one-to-one relationship. With regard to the controversy, I mean, of course, Maya Lin's work was a public work, and so but you know, when I was looking at it, it struck me as kind of a prototypical memorial, contemporary memorial, in terms of this temporal structure. So I guess I use it rhetorically as a starting point because people are kind of familiar with the monument, and then it gets me to be able to talk about this work that's really made more for an art world or concert dance world. So I do have a kind of, there is a gap there, I admit, in my own work. Yeah, with Sakala's work, it was actually surprisingly uncontroversial, even within its community, particularly as Hannah Krustern points out. Particularly since she was wearing the tefillin, which was supposed to, you know, she's making the work for a Jewish audience, breaking with orthodoxy, but it seems like her intention, which was to sort of galvanize her community, sort of trumped that. You're right, Maya Lin's monument functions in a very different public, in a public forum, has a very different public function. I'm still sort of interested in this sort of singular viewer's experience of it. But I can see it is something I should really sort of develop. And particularly the public memory studies, you said, that's an area of scholarship I'm not familiar with, so I'll look into that. Maybe I can pick your brain for bibliography later, public memory studies. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. It's a wonderful, very provocative paper. I'm thinking about what Kathy Caruth says about trauma, and one of the things she says about psychic trauma, which became a theme late in your paper, is that what is the problem of not being able to remember the past in terms of psychic trauma is not the past, but she says the not being able to come to terms with the fact that one has survived the traumatic incident. And so the body work that needs to be done is to, at the block that has stopped the how was I able to survive this, to be able for the body to move through that and to claim that survival. And so that's a slightly different way of looking at your third theme, the return to the past and the present, focusing on the coming to terms with survival and coming to terms working through the trauma bodily. So I can see how that could complement what you do with the Vietnam Memorial, because it is a question sort of a public survival after the war. I can see with the Kaddish very much, again, it's one of the profound questions after the Holocaust was the question of their survivors and the tremendous pain of dealing with that and persons who were unable to deal with it and after years would commit suicide and it was a question of not being able to survive, it wasn't remembering the past. with the artist, the other one though, Darcy Abitella, I'm not sure if I can see that the survival would, how that, I just can't see my way through that, and I don't know if that makes that one different. It makes that particular way of thinking about your thesis not as productive as it occurred to me that Carruth might be. So do you have any thoughts on what I've just said?
Yeah, I've just recently encountered Carruth, and so I haven't incorporated her, and she does talk about scarring as well, which which I sort of discovered after the fact, not in time for this. In particular, what you said about the block, that sort of that you can't get past. When Kristeva talks about timelessness, the Freudian Zeitlos, she calls it a scandal in Intimate Revolt, and she goes back to this Latin root of scandal, scandalon, as a blockage, an obstacle, an impediment, and that's sort of what's happening psychically. Another model of looking at the past that I like is the psychoanalyst Dominique Scarfone, who describes all of that Zeitlos not as past, but as unpassed. That the work of analysis is to make that experience, that trauma past, to put it into some sort of narrative for oneself. And it's only when you've distinguished past from present that it's no longer unpassed. Yes, this question of survival, yeah, that's something I certainly want to consider more. In the longer version of this paper, which is a chapter from a book that I'm writing on the experience of time in art and dance, I also use Carrie Mae Weems and a work that she does, which is in part a memorial to people who were enslaved in the United States. So that question of survival comes up again. If I were to stretch it and try to fit Abitella within that framework, I might tie her work to a tradition seen, for instance, in first-generation feminism. I'm thinking of performance artist Suzanne Lacey and Leslie Labovitz, who organized what they called media events. In particular, there was one about the so-called Hillside Strangler, serial rapist and murderer in LA, and it was a way of bringing women together to protest and stand up against violence, sexual violence. I mean, we don't know exactly what happened to these women. It's hard to characterize it, but I think there's often the fear that they've been abducted by men, particularly. Paula, for instance, was an art student at a college. I think one of the reasons that Darcy Abitella found it so moving, she also is an artist from the northeastern U.S. So yeah, certainly something that I'll look into. Thank you.
I was wondering about your statement, time is scandalized, and I'm glad that you returned to that concept of the scandal, because I think that there may be some connections between your talk and the earlier talk, and perhaps the relationship between scandal as both symptom and work, because in the Vietnam Memorial it caused a scandal, right? So, but your claim is that the work of Maya Lin is actually scandalizing time. So there is a kind of a reduplication of scandal going on that interrupts time. And it might be similar to the concept of estrangement as it was being described in the earlier talk. And I was wondering if you see this scandal, because I'm also thinking of the poetic. Scandal might mean blockage and impediment, but it's also the root of scansion in poetry. So, and scansion as a kind of interruption. I wonder if that's how you're thinking about scandal.
Yeah, so the risk of kind of oversimplifying myself, I guess the way I've been thinking of it is that the work of art produces the scandal, or using Scarfone's word, a kind of unpassed. We're not sure of the time of the monument, and that the work is a burden put on the viewer to to make sense of this crossing of these two times. So, you know, I really see art as not just the objects on the wall or installed or whatever, but it's the viewer that kind of completes the experience in that way, and has to do the cyclical work of making sense of it. And related to that, I think that's the role of criticism as well. Kristeva describes, it was a sentence I took out because I was running, didn't want to run out of time. In the sense and nonsense of Revolt, Kristeva says that criticism's task is to bring new figures of temporality to the fore. So it's doing the work of kind of writing the time of the monument or the memorial to write or explicate that scandal, either professionally as a critic or just as a viewer coming to terms with it. So I think for me that's where I'm seeing the work lying right now.
Thank you so much again. We've got to move on, but if you have lingering questions, you can save them for the break afterward.